everyone, my name is Angelina, and our project title is The Psychological Impact of U.S. Bomb Testing in Vieques, Puerto Rico. Now, before we get into the specific impacts of the bombings on Vieques, let's understand the broader historical context that sets the stage for everything that happened on the island. Puerto Rico became a U.S. territory after the Spanish-American War in 1898, which means it was ceded to the United States under the Treaty of Paris. But Puerto Rico wasn't fully incorporated into the U.S. It became what's known as an unincorporated territory, which means Puerto Ricans were not granted full rights or citizenship in the way that stateside Americans were. It wasn't until 1917 when the U.S. passed the Jones-Shafroth Act that Puerto Ricans were granted U.S. citizenship. But even though they were now citizens, they still faced major limitations. They didn't have the right to vote in U.S. presidential elections, and they didn't have full representation in Congress. So while Puerto Ricans were treated as citizens on paper, they didn't have the power to influence decisions that affected their own land and lives. This lack of political power sets the stage for what happens next in Vieques. In the 1940s, the U.S. Navy began using Vieques as a military training base. This was a strategic move as Vieques is located just a few miles off the coast of Puerto Rico, making it ideal for bombing practice and military exercises. Over time, the Navy took control of nearly 2/3 of Vieques, essentially transforming it into an extension of the Roosevelt Roads Naval Station. And this wasn't just about using a small section of the island. Entire communities were displaced, their homes and livelihoods uprooted, all in the name of military practice. Now here's where the story of Vieques takes on a more sinister tone. The choice to use Vieques as a military training ground wasn't random. It was about environmental racism. The people who lived on Vieques were predominantly Afro-Caribbean, and many of them were poor and without political power. They didn't have the means or influence to fight back against the military's takeover of their land. And more importantly, they had no political representation. They couldn't vote for the officials who could protect them, and they couldn't stop the Navy from taking over their homes. This is a prime example of how environmental racism operates. Those who are already marginalized, those with the least power and resources, are forced to bear the brunt of environmental destruction and risk. The people of Vieques were systemically pushed aside, their health and well-being disregarded, simply because they were seen as expandable by the U.S. military and government. So this historical context is crucial for understanding why the bombings on Vieques weren't just a military exercise. They were a direct result of colonial practices that marginalized and oppressed Puerto Ricans. I want to talk about what exactly happened in Vieques, Puerto Rico, and why it's such a powerful example of U.S. colonial violence. Even though a lot of people don't even know this happened, from 1941 all the way until 2003, that's over 60 years, the U.S. Navy used Vieques as a bombing range and military training ground. It's a small island that's part of Puerto Rico, and it was basically turned into a war zone. They dropped over 23 million pounds of bombs, including extremely dangerous substances like napalm, Agent Orange, and depleted uranium, which is radioactive. What makes this even more intense is that these weren't just military areas off in the distance. These bombs were going off very close to where people lived, sometimes just miles away from schools and houses. You can imagine hearing constant explosions, the ground shaking, the air being filled with chemicals for decades. That caused serious fear and stress for the people living there. It wasn't just annoying, it was terrifying and traumatic. The military also took away huge sections of land from the locals. People were pushed out of their homes, and they weren't allowed to go fishing, farming, or even visit beaches that had been part of their families' lives for generations. The U.S. basically came in and said, "We're using your land for war practice, and you can't do anything about it." And they didn't tell them the truth. There was no warning about how dangerous it would be or what chemicals they were exposed to. They just kept bombing.
Hello everyone, my name is Nadia, and in this presentation I will discuss the impact of the United States colonialism on the island of Vieques, Puerto Rico. In 1999, a civilian security guard named David Sainz was killed by a stray U.S. Navy band. His death became the spark that ignited massive protests across Puerto Rico. For the years, the name has used Vieques as a bombing range, harming the land and the people. But this tragedy pushed the community to take action. Local residents, students, religious leaders, and allies organized marches, peaceful occupations on bombing zones, and civil disobedience campaigns. Over 600 people were arrested during the protests, including public figures like Reverend Jesse Jackson and Robert Kennedy Jr. These actions gained international attention and showed the world that the people of Vieques will not be silenced. In 2003, after years of repression, the U.S. Navy officially withdrew from the islands. But the struggle did end there. The community continues to demand cleanup, justice, and accountability. This movement became a symbol of resistance, not just in Puerto Rico, but for any community fighting against environmental injustice and colonial oppressions. Even though the protests led to change, the damage was already done. The community has continued to suffer from serious health and environmental effects. After the Navy left Vieques in 2003, the damage remains. The land is still contaminated with toxic waste and unexploded bombs. Vieques has one of the highest cancer rates in Puerto Rico. Many residents also suffer from asthma, PTSD, and other serious health issues. The government has done very little to address these problems. So local leaders, doctors, healers have stepped in to support the community. Activists are also working to preserve the memory of what happened, especially for younger generation who didn't live through it. Through education, community organizing, and cultural projects, young people are reclaiming their story and demanding change. Vieques is still healing, but its people continue to resist, rebel, and fight for justice.
Hello everyone, my name is Mohammed and I will be talking about the after effects of the Vieques bombing runs and Puerto Rico today. Now we'll move on to the after effects of the Vieques bombing. Activists in Puerto Rico continue to demand aid from the government to help clean up, compensation, and rectification for their activities in Vieques. It is important to note that the government hasn't officially apologized for their actions in Vieques either. Organizations in Puerto Rico are working to educate the youth on what happened and to preserve the history of the event so that future generations remember their history and can learn from the past, as well as further a sense of community and national pride, which always happens after a community experiences a tragic event. Mental and physical recovery is also a big part of the relief effort, so local healers and community leaders are filling in where the government can't. People in Vieques actually have the highest age-adjusted cancer mortality rate in Puerto Rico at about 17 people per year, which is about 127 people per 100,000. These cancer patients were exposed to hazardous materials as debris, so they need medical treatment as well as transportation to the main island, which includes taxis and ferries. The case of the Vieques bombings serves as a reminder and warning as to how colonial violence has long-lasting effects on people well after the initial damage has been done. The younger generations of Puerto Ricans are doing what they can to empower change and not let the history of their land be forgotten. Even through everything that happened with Vieques, which garnered international attention, Puerto Rico today is still neglected and doesn't enjoy near the same level of autonomy or support as the other 50 states. In 2017, Hurricane Maria devastated Puerto Rico, and the government's attempt to help was considered slow and inadequate. And ever since their power grid was privatized out to Luma Energy in 2017, the island has experienced a sharp increase in blackouts. To add insult to injury, an insult comic named Tony Hinchcliffe made insensitive remarks about Puerto Rico and said, "There's literally a floating island of garbage in the middle of the ocean," during a Trump rally last year at MSG in New York, which has a sizable Puerto Rican population. Unsurprisingly, the joke didn't go over well, and he faced intense backlash in the news. He claimed it was a setup to discuss the issue of trash and landfills in Puerto Rico, but it came off as a way to deflect against people not thinking that the joke was funny after he received backlash for it. Although the news media covered the topic of the joke, it was quickly forgotten as part of the news cycle and replaced with other information regarding the upcoming elections. Rich Americans like online entrepreneur Brock Pierce and controversial YouTube star Logan Paul have moved to Puerto Rico in recent years and can enjoy tax breaks on their investments. Brock Pierce bought at least 14 properties across the island, and Logan Paul owns a $13 million estate in Dorado. While rich Americans with no ties to the land can buy a property and enjoy tax breaks while still being able to vote, native Puerto Ricans do not enjoy the same democratic freedoms as people on the mainland. They are also being priced out of where they live. America has been blatantly disrespecting Puerto Rico and Puerto Ricans ever since the 1900s, when it became a part of the United States. Puerto Ricans have always been considered as second-class citizens in the eyes of the American federal government. Here are all of our sources for the project. It is important to learn about the lesser-known history so that the mistakes of the past do not get repeated in the future. Thank you for listening to our project about the Vieques bombing and how Puerto Rico is still being neglected today.